ready.
Lovely. Okay, so we've moved north the area of King's Cross and St Pancras Station. You'll notice a lot quieter. We've only walked for about 30 seconds to a minute, but this area here is much more quiet, as you'll see behind me as we're looking. Consequently, I'm having to fight with traffic noise and other people slightly less, but that's good for the video. But this is the next spot I want to look at. So the stations, whilst they have been remodelled and kind of made much nicer, they have always been there from the 1850s, as you saw on the maps in the 1860s map. Those stations were there. They've just been kind of redesigned, which is obviously part of regeneration. Bringing a high-speed one is part of regeneration. But this area here, north of King's Cross, has been completely razed to the ground and rebuilt. So this is a really good spot to start thinking about kind of data collection and what we can do. So I want to pick up on kind of the first thing I kind of mentioned when I was speaking to you about kind of what you know of King's Cross, what people know of King's Cross, and I want to actually link that into regeneration. So it's all very well and good saying, well, this is what I know about King's Cross or don't know about King's Cross, and this is what my friends know about King's Cross and don't know about King's Cross, but actually everything we can think about an area or know about an area, we can link back to kind of the regeneration of that area. So I want to think a little bit about people's perceptions, which is kind of what I touched on, but perceptions are quite a difficult thing to actually measure. You know how you feel about an area, I know how I feel about an area, but actually what we should probably think about is how we can measure those perceptions, but also we should think about how we go about measuring those perceptions. So in your booklets, the first thing you have got after the methods table, the first thing you've got is a perception survey. So I want to talk about how you go about doing and using the perception survey in order to have a look at how the area has changed. Now, perception is really important to remember that it is people's perception of an area. So this is the kind of thing that actually will be best done not looking around, but maybe even done before going to a fieldwork location. It's what people have about preconceived ideas about the area. And you'll note from the perception survey that you've got in your booklet that what we've done is we've chosen a series of categories. Things like interesting to not interesting, safe to unsafe, well designed to badly designed, lots of different categories, and you can look through those. There's no point me reading through them. But what I would like to talk about is kind of how we go about filling this in and what it tells us. So firstly, you'll notice that the scale goes from +3 to -3, so very strongly felt to very strongly felt on -3, from kind of interesting to not interesting. And when you have a score with two extremes like that, so these are +3 to -3, that's called a bipolar scale. And the idea is it's got one extreme to the other extreme. And what we would do is we'd use our perceptions of an area and we would fill that in and we'd be able to total up our score, and that would give us a number. Now if you were to compare that to your kind of colleague next door, in fact what you could do is kind of using what you know of King's Cross, you could have a go at filling this out and actually compare with the person next to you. Did you get the same score? Did you not get the same score? Why didn't you get the same score? Now, you're thinking that's really obvious. You know, we think different things about different stuff. Absolutely, that is the point of perception. You know, one person in your class might come to King's Cross every weekend, have family living around the corner, whereas one person might have never been and have a completely different perception. So what we should probably think about is how we can actually use that data. Because at the moment, if I asked you to fill out a perception survey and you were collecting that data yourself, you'd have one sample size of one, just yours. But if I was interested in perception and I actually asked all of you in your class to fill it out, I would have a larger sample size of how sixth formers felt about King's Cross. So that's great. I'd have a bit of a sample, you know, a bit of an idea about how sixth formers felt about King's Cross. But the problem is, I'd only have an idea about how sixth formers felt about King's Cross at your school. If I wanted a full idea of perception, you'd need to think about kind of, do we need to think about getting the views of different people, maybe different ages? As I alluded to at the beginning, people of different ages would have different perceptions of King's Cross because of their understanding of how it is and how it has changed. Maybe you want to think about people who have different lived experiences and how that affects their perception. Now this would, if you were doing this for your NEA, this would be something that you would want to consider. You wouldn't necessarily want to go with a scattergun approach and get everybody's perception. You might, or you might want to think about a sampling strategy. How are you going to get people's perceptions? And we'll talk a little bit more about sampling strategies a bit later on. I don't want to bombard you with loads of information, so we'll pick that up a bit later. But to kind of introduce that idea of sampling strategies, you're going to want to think about who you're going to ask in the perception survey and how many people, which is your sample size. That kind of starts to lay the groundwork for thinking about sampling. What we also need to do is throughout this, we're going to be thinking about kind of the limitations and kind of the advantages of different methods. Now, you'll notice I'm going to rip my methods apart. That's really, really important. What I'm talking through today is not like the very, very best geography. I'm giving you guys an example. And for your NEA, what you'll want to do is think about, actually, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm going to take that and run with it. I'm going to find out more information. I'm going to make it better. And that's what will be really, really good to see. But just to think about kind of advantages and disadvantages and limitations of this method, I've already said about the fact that actually, it is a bit subjective, but that's the kind of point of perception surveys. It is people's opinions, so don't be tempted to fall into that trap of going, it's subjective, different people's views are different. That is kind of the point with perception surveys. It'd be interesting to maybe ask your colleagues about what you did if you weren't sure. There's one on here that is, I've got to find it now. There's one on here, personal and impersonal. And very, very often people are like, well, I don't really know what that means. What's personal and impersonal supposed to do? And if that's the case, maybe people in your group, they went, oh, I'm not really sure. I'm just going to put it in the 0 column. Not felt, don't really know. And actually, I've designed this score with a 0 column. But you might think, well, actually, if I was doing a bipolar score, do I want a 0 column? Is that going to enable people just to tick the middle? Or actually, is it really important to see if people feel or not feel about an area, or don't know about an area? That's equally as valid. So, and the other thing is those categories. The categories on here are just a broad selection of categories. They're not necessarily the best categories. You might feel that there are better things you can ask that will help answer your question. I've got them on here as a broad example of the different questions that you could ask. So that's the idea of a perception survey. I want to talk about that first because, like I said, perception surveys should really be talked about kind of before you go anywhere. And I'll often say, don't look around you, just look at your sheet. And then we want to then, once we've got our perception, we can as geographers start to actually build up a picture of what the area is like using other data collection methods. So, the next thing, if you turn over your booklet, is photo logs. Now, this is taking video and photos throughout today, so you will have photos. But I also want to think about how else you can use photos. So, it's all very good walking around, taking photos, but when you think about how we can get a little bit more geography out of those photos, because actually that's what we want to do, is analyse the area in a kind of geographical way. So I just want to introduce a couple of photo techniques to you. Firstly, one of the things is you can take a photo and you can look at it, and you as a geographer can go, oh, I can see the geography there, that makes loads and loads of sense. But actually, when you think about how you're going to kind of analyse that photo and draw the geography out of that photo. So one way of doing that would be annotated photographs. And the idea that you could take a photograph, but actually you could, as I've said, for regeneration, we're thinking about social, economic and environmental aspects of regeneration. I could take a photo of the view behind me, and what we could then do is I could then start saying, well, actually, we've got this grass area in the middle. Maybe that's to kind of make it look a little bit nicer. We can start to think about the fact that we've got bike racks that might just be out of shot. And we could talk about encouraging people to travel to this area in a particular way. We could even start to pick up some of the signage that's on the ground about coronavirus and kind of how they're kind of responding to that and trying to make people feel safe in this area. So there's lots of things you can draw out from a picture just with a little bit of annotation. The other way you can use kind of photography is using historical photographs. So I'll try and say that again, historical photographs. So I've just got a selection of photographs here of both King's Cross and St Pancras before they were kind of regenerated and rebuilt. And you can see these kind of date from the kind of 1950s here with the steam, and we've got 1980s with some nice diesel locomotives, and then moving on to the 2000s we can see how it has been rebuilt. So gone through kind of a big change. Now obviously you're not going to be there in the 1950s and take photos, but it's completely reasonable to see if you can find historical photos and actually look and see if you can find modern day equivalents. And that technique is called rephotography. The idea of finding historical photos and then finding modern day equivalents. Another thing you can do with photography is with Google Street View. You can rewind time, which is really, really useful. You can't go back, obviously, to the 1950s, because they didn't have ancient Street View cars, but you can certainly go back a few years and see how the area has changed. So that is another way of thinking about rephotography. Just to go back to the historical photos I've got, you can see I've got some of the King's Cross area, and what I've done is I've picked photos that actually show the various aspects that I wanted to talk about in my regeneration investigation, like environmental, where we've got kind of rubbish being dumped. We've got kind of signs of industry here, and housing, which is the social aspect. So I've just tried to show the variety of different ways in which this meets my investigation. So that's the photography. The photograph log in your booklet is purely because if you take loads of photographs, it's really worth making a note of what they are. So that's just a little reminder you can do that.